What if we made an MMO except it had absolutely zero leveling progression? What if we took the endgame gameplay loop of other popular games and instead of having players work towards this eventually, we allow them to just hop right in? Have you ever wanted to play the endgame of an MMO without having to do any of the work of getting there? Some games require an immense amount of playtime just to even reach the intro to the endgame. But today I've got something a little different, a game where you're just hopping into dungeons, getting better and better loot while taking on more and more challenging content. I'm obviously talking about this brand new online dungeon crawler which just entered early access a couple of days ago, Fellowship. And they were gracious enough to even sponsor today's video. Now, this is the first game to come out of Chief Rebel Studio. Fellowship is their flagship title, where you're going to be picking from 9 different heroes, each of which you can progress with and gear up separately. There's essentially 9 different characters inside of Fellowship. There's 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 5 DPS. Each of these classes has an entire kit that's going to make up about 16 to 17 abilities per character. And you can gear up and progress with each of these characters separately, and you can switch between them whenever you like. So the concept is really simple. You sign into a lobby, you queue up for dungeons, you mingle with other players, upgrade and customize your gear and appearance, and that's pretty much the entire premise. However, let me tell you, just because the concept is simple doesn't mean the rest of the game is. There's a ton of depth, challenge, and if you're as bad as I am, frustration awaiting you in Fellowship. So with that being said, I'm going to take you all through my playthrough, showing you the ins and outs of the game, giving you my thoughts and my opinions and my future expectations. I honestly think that this game is exactly what not only myself, but a lot of people in the MMO space have been looking for. So without further ado, let's get into it. So when you first start the game, you choose a name, and Fellowship will ask if you want to participate in a tutorial. Considering this was my first time ever logging in, I thought, why not? Now, the tutorial is a little basic. If you've ever played an MMO, you should be mostly good. You kick things off starting as Helena, which is one of the tank classes. You're shown how to run, look around, use the camera, jump, the basics, and then you're shown a bit of combat without skills at first, and then the game will slowly introduce your complete skill set. Along the way, you pick up some of the other playable heroes who join your party, and you face off against a troll boss with a couple of basic mechanics. Easy enough, and afterwards you're shown the hero page where you can choose which hero you want to play as. As I mentioned, there are 9 separate heroes. There's 2 tanks, Helena and Miko, tons of DPS from casters to rangers to rogues, as well as 2 healers. There's more of a druid-esque healer and a priest kind of healer. As I mentioned before, each of these classes are basically your characters that you can progress. You could theoretically get the best in slot gear on each of these characters and then swap between them whenever you like. As always, I'm a bit of a sucker for mages, specifically fire mages, so I went with Ardeos. And afterwards, you're loaded into the Stronghold, which is basically the main player hub where you can do basically everything in the game that isn't instanced dungeon content. And here you get a first glimpse at the user interface, which is completely customizable. By the way, every single aspect of the heads-up display can be resized and moved around the screen, which is nice. But to be honest, I actually appreciated the simple default design. Down in your bottom right, you can see you have your damage and healing meters, which you can customize, and then you have your action bar with slots for 16 skills plus an ultimate. Also, over here you have a quick slot for your mount, and the rest is fairly self-explanatory. The first thing the game tells you to do is look around at every single point of interest within the Stronghold, of which there's actually quite a few. You have your standards like the Dungeon Finder, a mirror to change your appearance, a leaderboard, a bank. But furthermore, there are some unique spots. The blacksmith, for example, allows you to upgrade your gear. There's a couple of different shops where you can use different currencies, and different places where you can add gems to your gear, etc. It seems like the gear progression actually has a fair amount of depth to it, and it's rather customizable. Another important thing to note within the Stronghold is the combat training dummy area. I highly recommend that before you ever try a new champion, to at least spend some time here, to at least a little bit learn your kit before you actually make your way into one of the dungeons. It doesn't really matter, especially if you're just doing quick play. However, your group will still appreciate it if you know at least a little bit about how to play your character. Now, the first day of Fellowship's release did not go completely as expected. As you can imagine, with any new studio's first game, 20,000 plus players trying to join the game all at the same time might result in some server issues. So I kept a close eye on the Discord, and the team, who is from Sweden, worked tirelessly until about 5 in the morning trying to fix the servers. I tried my best, but I unfortunately wasn't really able to play much on the first day as I couldn't get into queues and I couldn't even sign into the game. And a lot of people were quite unhappy, but ultimately this is pretty much expected with new online games at this point. If you think day one is going to go smoothly without a hitch, especially when it comes to a studio's first game, you're sorely mistaken. So anyway, day 2. According to the Discord, everything seemed to be working fairly well. Apparently there were some odd lag spikes here and there, but those didn't seem to affect me at all. So let's get into it. Now, how dungeons work in Fellowship is there are 4 players within a group. You can use the group finder to find other players to join you in Quickplay, where basically everyone has equalized gear and stats. Your outside gear has no effect on Quickplay. And this is the lowest difficulty version of the dungeon. This allows you to pick up the basics of your class to test your abilities in terms of DPS or healing or tanking before entering the later, more difficult versions of the content. Within Quickplay, you can access almost every dungeon that can be accessed in later difficulties. They're just much easier and the queue times tend to be pretty quick. So I signed up for my first Quickplay match, and the first dungeon I loaded into was Godfall Quarry. At this point, I didn't quite understand how Ardeos, my fire mage, was best played. To be honest, it's not as easy as just pressing your abilities in the right order. There's a ton of depth that goes into these classes, and a really good player will absolutely stand out from his group. I'll get a bit more into that later as I explain some of the complexities of my Fire Mage's rotation, but after playing a few of the other classes, this really seems to be the case pretty much across the board regarding the heroes. Each of them has plenty of room for them to be played really well. Anyway, most of the dungeons are pretty short. There's a few groups of trash, which will each have their own mechanics, some of which sort of prepare you for the boss up ahead. Certain dungeons like this one will have a sort of mini-boss or more difficult piece of trash before finally culminating in the big boss fight at the end. It seems like most of the bosses will rotate between 4 or 5 mechanics. Obviously, in Quickplay, messing these mechanics up is not detrimental. However, I have heard that later on and in harder difficulties, basically missing anything or stepping slightly out of line at the wrong moment can result in the entire group wiping. Now, some of this boss's mechanics include a couple of don't stand in stupids and then a couple of why aren't you standing in this stupids, but Fellowship definitely doesn't shy away in terms of ramping up the difficulty, especially as you start pushing into some of the higher ranks. And then after beating the boss, a giant chest appears, and because we're just on Quickplay, you don't receive any gear, and instead you receive supplies and something known as Marks of Fellowship, which are both currencies that can be used at different vendors within the Stronghold. Also, upon completing dungeons, you'll notice this bright shining rewards button in the top right. This opens up a reward track where you'll be able to learn new skills, acquire a mount, get gold and supplies, as well as train talent points to make your character more powerful. The entire left side of the reward track can be entirely acquired through Quickplay. However, on the right side, you'll find different rewards which can be acquired by beating the content on harder and harder difficulties. Next, you'll want to spend the supplies that you just got from completing the dungeon. This vendor down here sells common equipment with an item level of 15. And I definitely recommend picking up a few of these items and completing at least a couple of the dungeons within Quickplay before jumping into ranked. First of all, this will allow some time for you to learn your character and class, but it also gets you a little bit of a higher item level before taking on the more challenging content. So now let's talk about how difficulty scales in Fellowship. Essentially, you have Quickplay, then you have ranked or challenge mode, and this is where you're going to be spending the majority of your time. The ranks are split into 4 different categories. There's Contender, Adept, Champion, and Paragon. And then finally, after beating the hardest challenge within Paragon, you finally unlock something known as Eternal. Eternal is an uncapped scaling difficulty challenge that just gets harder and harder as you progress until eventually, I'm assuming, it's impossible to progress any further. Now, when you join up for a ranked game, it can take slightly longer than Quickplay. At least in the Contender rank, however, it was still fairly quick for me to get into a group. I'd say on average it took about 2 minutes of waiting, max, as a DPS character, and if you're a tank, it's going to be instant. But with challenge mode, instead of the queue just popping and getting immediately put into a dungeon, you'll receive a voting page, and here you can see 3 options. We have Contender 1, 2, and 3. You see, within every category of difficulty, there are also 6 levels, and the queue will match you up with those levels of difficulty depending on your current item level. And then once you have the max or close to the max item level within that difficulty, you'll be able to enter the 7th level, so to say. And this will be its own standalone dungeon and challenge that you and your group will have to complete within a certain time frame in order to unlock the next rank of difficulty. So in order to go from Contender to Adept. We'll get into more on that later, but as you can see here, we as a team can vote for these 3 different dungeons on 3 different difficulty levels, and it also displays all of the loot you could potentially receive. My first run was in Silken Hollow on Contender 1. Honestly, Contender 1 is basically just Quickplay at this point. There's no added mechanics or modifiers to make it much more difficult. I had another Ardeos in my group with me, and he was definitely out DPSing me, which pissed me off and made me want to understand my class a little bit better. Anyway, the dungeon ended in this cool spider boss with tons of venom mechanics, and afterwards I received my first piece of gear from a dungeon, a new chess piece, as well as the gold and other currencies that you would have received in Quickplay. And from this point forward, I just kept pushing further and further within the Contender difficulty. I finished Stormwatch on Contender 3, which got me this cool new staff. Although it is an ice staff, which doesn't necessarily fit with my fire mage theme, it was still a huge upgrade. Now, because I was still getting a ton of supplies from completing each dungeon as well, I was actually able to fill out the rest of my equipment slots using the vendor. Obviously, you'll want to upgrade all of these by completing more and more dungeons, but at least for the time being, this was better than nothing. I was also really starting to fill out my reward track as well, getting new talent points and tons of gold, and also filling out the contender section of the rewards too, which gives you even more talent points. Now, if you see here, we finished this dungeon with 39 seconds left to go on the timer. You see, as you move up through the difficulties, not only does the dungeon get more difficult, the enemies have more health and pick up more mechanics, but also you start getting timed. And failing the timer means there's reduced rewards, and there's also other modifiers which can be placed on a dungeon. You can get curses or debuffs or increased mechanics. But at this point, I was really starting to have a lot of fun. I did a bit of research into my class, Ardeos, and how I should actually be playing him. Now, I've spent a lot of time playing mages across my MMO career, however, Ardeos is totally unique. He almost plays more like a warlock, because basically your entire rotation revolves around this one ability, Detonate. And what Detonate does is when an enemy has a damage over time ability on them, you can use Detonate to deal damage equal to 2.5 seconds of said damage over time. So this renders your entire rotation to dotting up as many mobs as possible with as many dots as possible and then spamming Detonate. Now, the Detonate ability itself uses a resource known as Burning Embers, which can be built up by using other abilities, such as your main spammable Infernal Wave. You can then have a maximum of 4 Burning Embers at a time, meaning the goal of the entire rotation is to build up 4 embers, dot up as many mobs as possible, and then spam 4 detonates in a row. At least in theory anyway, to max out your DPS in a boss situation or a training dummy situation. However, every pull is going to function differently and last a different amount of time. So the more you play the class, the better feel you'll get for how full of a rotation you might want to commit to. On top of that, there's a ton of secondary skills and effects. Ardeos has a giant AoE known as Apocalypse. He can shoot fire frogs that bounce around a group of enemies. And he has an ultimate ability called Incinerate, where you fly into the air and basically channel a flamethrower at the enemy. And all around, he's a complete blast to play. Now, if you take a look at each of the heroes on the Hero Select page, you'll actually see a difficulty rating for each of the heroes. For example, Helena the Tank is rated 2 stars, but Miko is rated 4 stars. And Ardeos is only 3 stars, which was surprising to me because he's a very busy character. Your DPS can basically completely stagnate if you're not paying close attention. So this really just made me more excited to try out all of the other characters as well, because there's just a ton of room for you to become better and better at each of them. Anyway, at this point, I just kept grinding, completing dungeons, and working through my reward tracks. I actually got some new cosmetics. First, I got access to these white initiate robes, which looked pretty cool, but after completing most of the contender difficulty, I also received these blue rebellious robes, which I thought looked even cooler. I'm always a big fan of cosmetics that can be unlocked through gameplay, and as you progress through Fellowship, you can unlock cooler and cooler looking sets for your character. One important thing to know about is that once you start replacing your gear with better pieces, you can actually take your old gear to the scrapper, where you can destroy it and then you receive gold in its place. Gold is important because it can then be used at the blacksmith to upgrade each piece of your gear even further. Every time you upgrade a piece of gear, it increases its item level by 15, and each piece of equipment can be upgraded up to 8 times, but these get expensive fairly quickly. Also, the rarity of said piece of equipment will start with a higher item level, so a fully upgraded blue chest piece will end up with a higher item level than a fully upgraded green chest piece. At some point later on, I got this Book of Revival. It's a trinket as a drop, and this was actually huge. Basically, your 2 trinket slots will grant you 2 extra abilities. This Book of Revival gave me the ability to battle res, which was super handy. But other trinkets that you can get might buff the group or grant you a shield or increase the group's speed. I can imagine that later on, everyone in your group might be required to have the correct trinkets to deal with certain mechanics in challenging dungeons. Anyway, all of this finally culminated with me achieving an item level of 60 and completing a dungeon on the difficulty Contender 6. And by doing so, I unlocked the Sithril Falls dungeon. You see, once you've hit item level 60 and completed Contender 6, then Contender 7, the Sithril Falls, is more likely to appear in your matchmaking. Now, this is much more challenging than any of the other dungeons that you've completed so far. It's longer, it has 3 boss fights, the trash is tankier, and it has to be completed within a time limit for you to progress onto the next rank. Adept. So I managed to find a group and we went in. They seemed decent, but we did struggle slightly on the first boss. We even wiped once, which didn't bode well for our continued progress in the dungeon. Plus, the timer means it's a pretty strict time crunch, so any wipes are pretty detriment to actually completing the dungeon in the required time. We made it to the second boss and ended up wiping there again due to a mechanic with flying orbs, and the group unfortunately disbanded. But I decided to try just one more group, and these guys were pretty good. Especially the tank. He was doing a great job. He knew the best path to take, he was able to skip certain groups of enemies, and all in all, this run was going really smoothly. We cleared the first boss in basically no time. Unfortunately, we did have one wipe on the second boss, but we hurried back as fast as we could and managed to take him down. The problem was we only had about 9 minutes left to clear our way to the last boss and defeat him. So we went as fast as we possibly could up a mountain towards the boss's room, taking out all the trash along the way. We finally entered the final boss fight with about 5 minutes to spare, and for having never done this fight before, we all picked up the mechanics pretty quickly. There's a soak, there's some area of effect stuff, there's a mechanic where he targets 2 separate teammates and they need to make sure they aren't touching each other, and this all happens while the actual area around the boss slowly fills in with ice. It gets smaller and smaller until you basically have nowhere to move. But unfortunately, when the boss was down to about 9% HP, and with only 2 minutes left to spare on the timer, we wiped. We ran back as fast as we could to make another valiant attempt, but alas, the timer slowly ticked down and passed. However, we did finish the fight, and I got my first piece of rare gear from a dungeon. It was a good effort, and I'm gonna get it the next time I hop on. But all in all, I'm having a great time in Fellowship. I don't want to name and shame any other games, but this sort of endgame only loop has been attempted many times before. But none of them have been as fun, as polished, and as in-depth as what I've seen from Fellowship so far. The freedom to play whatever character or whatever role and get better and better with said character and role at the drop of a hat is a freedom that you just wouldn't find in most MMOs. Not without a ridiculous amount of time investment into said character before you can actually even participate in the endgame, but Fellowship just puts you right there. And it doesn't shy away in its difficulty and depth. I'm genuinely excited to get better and better with Ardeos, but also to try out some of the other DPS classes. The Rogue, Mara, looks like a ton of fun. The healing also looks immensely challenging in this game, and tanking, well, I've never been much of a tank, but once I learn the dungeons a bit more, I wouldn't mind trying that as well. Anyway, folks, if you want to pick up Fellowship, the early access is available for purchase, and it would help me out a ton if you use my link that's found in the description as well as the pinned comment. I'll be playing a ton this week before taking a bit of a vacation, as I'm currently in the process of a very large move for me and my family, but if you guys want to hop into some dungeons, make sure to join my Discord as well. Anyway, folks, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a sub. Those things help a bunch, and I will catch you all in the next one. Later.